In 2009, FBI agents watched through special camera lenses that see far away. They saw a man with gray hair in a perfect suit walk into a simple Italian restaurant in a town just west of Chicago. They had spent 50 years trying to prove what everyone in the police force already knew. They knew that John No-Nose DiFronzo was the most powerful mob boss in Chicago. But he was not like the show-off gangsters who came before him, like Al Capone with his fancy suits and machine guns, or Sam Giancana with his famous girlfriends and nights at the club. DiFronzo had learned how to do something they never could, how to stay hidden. While other mob bosses were killed by bullets or arrested by the government, DiFronzo would die at 89 years old in his own bed. He had beaten the government every single time. This is the story of the man who became like a ghost. By doing that, he became the most successful crime boss in Chicago's violent history. Before we step into the dark world of the Chicago mob, we want to know where in the world you are listening from. What time is it where you are? Drop your location and time in the comments below. If you think true crime and the secret world of mobsters are interesting, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. And if you enjoy this deep look, give us a thumbs up. It helps us bring you more secret stories from the world of crime. Now, let's go back to where it all began. To a Chicago that was still dealing with the end of the time when alcohol was illegal, where Italian families struggled to get by, and where a young boy named John DiFronzo would learn the rules of a world most people never see. On December 13th, 1928, while most of America was getting ready for Christmas, somewhere in Italy, a boy was born who would one day rule Chicago's world of crime. His name was John DiFronzo, though the world would later know him by a much more special nickname. The late 1920s were a strange time to be born. America was in the middle of the Roaring Twenties, but under all the jazz music and fancy secret bars, a darker world was growing. The law against alcohol had created a giant business of illegal drinks. And nowhere was this business more powerful than in Chicago, where Al Capone had turned organized crime from street fighting into a business worth millions of dollars. But John DiFronzo's story didn't begin in the shiny secret bars of downtown Chicago. It began across the ocean, in the poor and traditional land of southern Italy. There, his parents, Michael and Dolores DiFronzo, made the hard choice that many Italian families had made before them, to leave everything behind and look for a better life in America. The DiFronzo family arrived in Chicago in the mid-1930s. They joined a large group of Italian people who had been changing the city's population for decades. By the time young John arrived in America, probably as a 6 or 7-year-old child, the family moved into the working-class neighborhoods. Italian families gathered there, speaking their own language, keeping their old ways, and building close communities that would both protect them and hold them back. Michael DiFronzo was a metal plater, one of the many Italian newcomers who took whatever work they could find in Chicago's factories. It was hard, honest work, the kind that left your hands with scars and your back hurting, but it was work. And for families new to America during the Great Depression, that was enough. The Chicago that the DiFronzos came to in the mid-1930s was a city that was changing. The law against alcohol had just ended in 1933, and the criminal groups that had been built on illegal drinks were trying to figure out what to do next. Al Capone, the most famous gangster in American history, was already in jail, serving his time for not paying taxes. But the group he had built, the Chicago outfit, was far from finished. Young John DiFronzo grew up in this world, going to Wells High School on Chicago's North Side. It was a normal American education for the son of new Americans. Learn English, learn the rules, learn how to get around in a world where an Italian accent made you different, where your parents' old country ways seemed old-fashioned and strange. But there was another kind of learning happening on the streets of Chicago, one that had nothing to do with classrooms and textbooks. In the Italian neighborhoods of Chicago's West Side, young boys learned early that there were two paths they could take. The straight path of their fathers, working hard for little pay and simple lives, or the crooked path, where money came more easily and respect came more quickly. For boys like John DiFronzo and his younger brother Peter, the choice seemed clear. The straight world offered their father's life. Honest but hard poverty, hard work that didn't lead anywhere, and the constant struggle to keep a family fed and housed. The crooked world offered something more tempting: money, power, and respect. All you had to do was be willing to take what you wanted. The neighborhoods where John DiFronzo grew up were strongly under the control of what would become known as the Grand Avenue Crew. It was one of the Chicago outfit's most powerful and long-lasting street groups. Grand Avenue, the street the crew was named after, ran through the center of Chicago's Italian neighborhoods. And it was here that the outfit ran some of its most important businesses. The Grand Avenue Crew wasn't some faraway, strange idea. These were neighborhood guys, men who lived on the same streets, who knew your family, who went to the same social clubs and restaurants. They dressed well, drove nice cars, and got a kind of respect that hard-working men like Michael DiFronzo could never get. For a young man with big dreams like John DiFronzo, it was very attractive. Why break your back in a factory when you could make more money in a single night's work than your father made in a month? Why be a nobody when you could be a somebody, a man people respected and feared? By 1946, at the age of 17, John DiFronzo had made his choice. That year, he was arrested for breaking and entering, his first time on record getting in trouble with the law. The charges led to 6 months of being watched by the court, a light punishment that did nothing to stop him from the path he had chosen. It was a common pattern for young Italian-American men in these neighborhoods. You started small, stealing from stores, breaking and entering, maybe some small scams. If you showed you were good at it, if you proved you could be trusted to keep your mouth shut and follow orders, you might get the attention of older, more powerful criminals. And if you were really lucky, really talented, you might eventually earn your way into the outfit itself. But John DiFronzo's early criminal life almost ended before it really began, in an event that would give him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. On December 14, 1949, it was 3 days after John DiFronzo's 21st birthday, and he was working with a partner named Charles Sislo. DiFronzo had broken into the Fay Manning dress shop at 304 North Michigan Avenue, right in the middle of Chicago's fancy Gold Coast shopping area. The plan was simple: get in, grab the stuff, and get out. It was the kind of quick robbery that young burglars had been doing for a long time. But on this night, something went wrong. The police arrived while DiFronzo and Sislo were still inside the shop, trapped with no easy way out. The two burglars had to make a choice: give up or run. They chose to run. What happened next has different stories, each telling a slightly different version of that wild night. According to some stories, DiFronzo was trying to escape through a window when he cut off a piece of his nose on the broken glass. It's the version that sounds almost funny. A clumsy burglar so desperate to get away that he hurts himself badly in the process. But there was another story, one that was in the newspapers at the time. According to this version, when the police faced the two burglars, shots were fired. DiFronzo supposedly shot at the officers with a .45 caliber handgun. The police shot back, and in the shootout, part of DiFronzo's nose was shot off. The truth, as it often is, may be somewhere in the middle. What we know for sure is that both DiFronzo and Sislo were seriously hurt in the standoff. They were taken to Bridewell Hospital, where they were said to be in very bad condition with gunshot wounds to their stomachs. DiFronzo's wound, whether from glass or bullets, was so bad that a piece of his nose was completely cut off. There's a dark, funny twist to what happened next. The police, in a way that seems almost ridiculously thoughtful for the situation, gave the missing piece of DiFronzo's nose back to him. He had plastic surgery, and the surgeons did such a good job that the damage was almost impossible to see. Most people who met John DiFronzo in later years had no idea he was missing part of his nose. But in the secret world of Chicago organized crime, nicknames stick. And so John DiFronzo became No Nose, a nickname that was partly funny since his nose looked perfectly normal, and partly a reminder of his early foolishness, his willingness to take risks, and his luck at surviving when things went wrong. It was also a lesson that DiFronzo seems to have taken seriously. Later in life, friends said he was sometimes called Johnny Bananas instead because of his yellowish skin. But No Nose was the name that stuck in news reports and FBI files, a name that would follow him through decades of investigations. When he recovered from his wounds, DiFronzo went from a hospital bed to a jail cell. In April 1950, he was sentenced to 6 months in Cook County Jail for assault with a deadly weapon from the dress shop robbery. It was his first real time behind bars. And for many young criminals, that first time in jail is a big choice. Do you go straight, or do you go deeper into the criminal life? John DiFronzo chose to go deeper. When DiFronzo was released from jail in 1950, he was 22 years old with a criminal record and few real job options. But he had one thing working for him. He had proven himself. He'd taken the arrest, served the time, and kept his mouth shut. In the world of organized crime, that was worth something. DiFronzo joined a burglary crew that would become famous among Chicago police, the 3-Minute Gang. The name came from their special trick. The average time it took for Chicago police to get to a burglar alarm was 3 minutes. The 3-Minute Gang specialized in hitting stores and taking everything in less time than it took the cops to arrive. It was precise work that needed planning, teamwork, and very steady nerves. You had to know exactly what you were after, where it was, and how to get in and out quickly. There was no time for mistakes, no room for panic. You went in, you took what you came for, and you were gone before the sirens even got close. The 3-Minute Gang was exactly the kind of group that John DiFronzo liked. It wasn't random violence, and it wasn't stupid. It was professional, organized crime at its best. You did the job, you sold the stolen goods, you got paid, and then you moved on to the next one. For most of the 1950s, DiFronzo worked with different burglary crews, including one run by a famous Chicago thief named Paul Peanuts Panchko. Panchko was a master thief, someone who had turned burglary into an art. He could check out a location, plan a job down to the smallest detail, and do it with a professionalism that even the police had to respect. Working with someone like Panchko was an education for DiFronzo. He learned how to plan, how to manage risk, and how to work as part of a team. He learned the importance of good information, knowing when a store would have the most valuable items, when security would be weakest, and what the police response times were. He also learned something else, something that would define his whole career: the importance of discipline. Show-off criminals got caught. Stupid criminals got caught. Greedy criminals got caught. But smart, disciplined criminals could work for years without ever spending much time in jail. While John DiFronzo was improving his skills as a burglar, the Chicago outfit was going through its own changes. The flashy days of Al Capone were long gone. They were replaced by a more advanced, businesslike way of doing organized crime. The real power in the outfit during the 1950s was held by two men, Paul, the waiter, Rika, and Anthony, Joe Batter's Accardo. Unlike Capone, who had loved publicity and enjoyed being famous for bad reasons, Rika and Accardo preferred to work from the shadows. They understood that the key to lasting a long time in organized crime was to be invisible. RICO, who had taken over after Capone was sent to prison, had learned his lesson the hard way. In 1943, he and other top outfit leaders had been found guilty of forcing Hollywood movie studios to pay them money, and RICO had served time in federal prison. When he was released, he made sure that his name was rarely in newspapers, that his face was never on television, and that the police had a hard time even proving he was involved in the outfit's business. Accardo, his underboss and eventually his equal partner, followed the same idea. Together, they ran the outfit for decades, much longer than Capone had. They did it by being smart, being careful, and letting others be in the spotlight. In 1957, feeling pressure from the government's tax agency, Accardo officially stepped down as boss. In his place, RICO and Accardo put Sam Giancana, a flashy, ambitious mobster who was everything they were not. Giancana loved the attention. He dated famous people, including singer Phyllis McGuire. He was friends with Frank Sinatra. He supposedly helped John F. Kennedy win the 1960 presidential election, then became a target when Kennedy's top lawyer, his brother Robert, started a strong fight against organized crime. While all this high-level drama was happening, John DiFronzo was working on the streets, building his reputation within the Grand Avenue crew. He wasn't a made member yet. That honor was still years away. But he was proving himself to be a reliable, smart worker. The outfit was built on a structure with levels, similar to other Mafia families. At the top was the boss, helped by an underboss and a counselor. Below them were capos, or captains, who ran individual crews. Each crew controlled specific criminal businesses in specific areas. And below the capos were the soldiers, the made members who did the actual work. But the outfit also hired many associates, criminals who worked for the organization without being officially brought in as members. These associates did everything from running gambling operations to collecting debts to carrying out killings. If they proved they were capable and trustworthy, they might eventually be made. If they messed up, they might disappear. John DiFronzo spent much of the 1950s as an associate, proving he was valuable enough to keep around, but not yet important enough to be made. He did burglaries. He collected money, and most importantly, he kept his mouth shut and stayed out of trouble. Well, mostly out of trouble. John DiFronzo's criminal record from the 1950s is pretty short, which probably means he was good at not getting caught. But in 1952, his name came up in a murder investigation, one that was never solved. Charles Gross was a politician from the West Side with possible ties to organized crime. On October 7, 1952, Gross was shot to death. The murder was professional and clean, the kind of killing that suggested the mob was involved. John DiFronzo was a suspect, one of several men who were investigated but never charged. Whether DiFronzo was actually involved in the Gross murder is something we'll never know. The case went cold, like so many mob killings from that time. But the fact that DiFronzo's name came up at all is important. It suggests that by 1952, at the age of 23, he was already being considered for more serious work than simple burglary. This was a very important time of change in the life of any aspiring mobster. Burglary and theft were one thing, relatively small crimes that might get you sent to state prison, but were unlikely to get serious federal attention. But murder was different. Murder meant you were being trusted with the outfit's most serious business. It meant you had proven you were capable of violence when violence was needed. It also meant you were being watched more closely by the police. Getting away with burglary was one thing. Getting away with murder required a whole different level of skill and discipline. By the late 1950s, DiFronzo was in his early 30s, an age when many criminals either moved up to more serious work or got too old for the life entirely. DiFronzo was clearly moving up. He was no longer just a burglar. He was becoming an enforcer, someone who could handle problems, someone who could be trusted with secret operations. In 1964, he was identified as part of a loan sharking business that included some former Chicago police officers, Albert Sarno and Chris Carty. This was classic outfit business, lending money at extremely high interest rates, then using violence or the threat of violence to collect. It was profitable. It was relatively safe compared to more obvious crimes, and it required the kind of organizational skills and personal discipline that DiFronzo had been developing. The fact that the operation included former cops was also revealing. The outfit had always kept connections to the police, building relationships with officers who could be bought or who would look the other way. These weren't necessarily corrupt cops in the usual sense. Many of them explained their cooperation by telling themselves they were just looking the other way on crimes without victims, or protecting their neighborhoods from outsiders. But whether they saw themselves as corrupt or just practical, their cooperation was essential to the outfit's operations. And the fact that DiFronzo was working with these former officers suggests he was being trusted with more and more sensitive work. While John DiFronzo was building his criminal career, his family was growing. His younger brother, Peter DiFronzo, was following in his footsteps, getting involved in burglary and other outfit operations. In 1961, Peter was arrested in connection with a major theft. 2 years later, in 1963, he was found guilty of warehouse burglary. Peter would eventually become a made member of the outfit, working closely with his brother throughout their careers. The DiFronzo brothers would run different businesses together, a construction company, a trash hauling business. These were real-looking businesses that hid their real source of money. This pattern of brothers working together was common in the outfit. Family ties were the strongest connections in a world built on betrayal and violence. You could trust your brother in a way you could never fully trust an associate or even a close friend. Brothers kept secrets. Brothers protected each other. Brothers took care of family business. For the DiFronzo brothers, this bond would last their entire lives. They would build their criminal empire together, face investigations together, and support each other through arrests and trials. When FBI agents watched the brothers in later years, they noted how close their relationship was and how they talked about every major decision. By the end of the 1950s and into the early 1960s, John DiFronzo was no longer the foolish young burglar who had lost part of his nose in a bad job. He was becoming a professional, a made member of the Grand Avenue crew, someone who understood how to survive in the dangerous world of organized crime. He had learned the most important lesson of all. The key to survival wasn't being the toughest or the most violent. It was being the smartest. It was knowing when to take risks and when to hold back. It was understanding that the most successful criminals weren't the ones everyone knew about. They were the ones nobody saw coming. It was a lesson that would serve John DiFronzo well in the years to come. While more showy mobsters got headlines and attracted police attention, DiFronzo would quietly build his power, making himself essential to the outfit's business while staying mostly hidden from the outside world. The stage was set for him to rise. As the 1960s began, the Chicago outfit was entering a time of both great power and great weakness. With Sam Giancana as the official leader, and Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo pulling the strings from the shadows, the organization had spread its influence far beyond the city of Chicago. The outfit controlled casinos in Las Vegas, taking millions of dollars from the profits. They had gotten inside labor unions, especially the Teamsters, giving them control over retirement funds they could use to pay for operations and construction projects. They ran gambling operations, loan sharking rings, and prostitution businesses across the Midwest. On paper, the Chicago outfit was one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America. But there were problems. The federal government, led by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, had declared war on organized crime. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, which had long denied that the Mafia existed, was now putting a lot of resources into investigating and arresting mob leaders. And Sam Giancana's high-profile lifestyle was drawing exactly the kind of attention that Rica and Accardo had always avoided. For a mid-level worker like John DiFronzo, this was both a danger and an opportunity. On one hand, more federal attention meant that everyone in the outfit was at greater risk. On the other hand, when powerful mob bosses went to prison, opportunities opened up for ambitious men to move up. DiFronzo was learning his job from some of the most effective organized crime leaders in Chicago history. The Grand Avenue crew, which he was part of, was one of the outfit's most profitable groups, involved in everything from gambling to loan sharking to controlling unions. But DiFronzo's specialty was still theft, especially high-end burglaries and jewelry robberies. This was advanced work that required detailed planning, reliable information, and the ability to sell stolen goods through networks of corrupt dealers and pawn shop owners. A successful jewelry robbery might bring in tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in a single night's work. The key was in the planning. You had to know which jewelry stores had the most valuable items, when they would be most at risk, and how to get past their security systems. You needed someone on the inside, either a corrupt employee or someone who could provide information. You needed a fence, someone who could take the stolen goods and sell them quickly before the police got too close. DiFronzo proved to be exceptionally good at this kind of work. He was very careful in his planning, careful in how he carried out the job, and disciplined enough to resist the urge to show off his success. When he did a job, he took his share, lived a simple life, and moved on to the next opportunity. This discipline was noticed in the mob. You are always being judged by your bosses. Are you a good earner? Can you be trusted? Do you have the right personality for this life? Can you keep your mouth shut when the police come asking questions? John DiFronzo passed every test. In the secret world of the Chicago outfit, relationships were everything. Your success depended not just on what you knew or what you could do, but on who you knew, who trusted you, and who was willing to speak up for you when opportunities came. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, DiFronzo built a network of relationships that would help him throughout his career. Three men in particular would be very important to his rise: his brother Peter DiFronzo, Joey the Clown, Lombardo, and Tony Spilatro. Peter DiFronzo was the obvious one. They were brothers in crime, literally. Peter was younger than John, but just as dedicated to the criminal life. The two brothers would work together throughout their careers, running various businesses, carrying out operations, and watching each other's backs. The FBI would eventually figure out that they controlled D&P Construction together, a trash hauling business that was both a real source of income and a front for criminal activities. In organized crime, trash hauling businesses were very valuable. They provided real income, gave jobs to crew members who needed a cover, and created opportunities for extortion. Businesses needed their trash hauled, and if they didn't use the right company, they might find their garbage piling up or worse. It was a classic outfit operation, part real business, part criminal business. Joey, the clown Lombardo, was a different kind of relationship. Lombardo was a capo, or captain, in the outfit's Grand Avenue crew, DiFronzo's direct boss in the organization. He was called the Clown because he had a habit of joking around and acting silly to draw attention away from himself. But there was nothing foolish about Lombardo's criminal smarts. He was smart, tough when needed, and very good at avoiding being arrested. Lombardo and DiFronzo worked together for years, and Lombardo clearly saw something in the younger man. DiFronzo wasn't flashy and wasn't looking for glory. He was a worker, someone who could be trusted to handle business without attracting unnecessary attention. These were exactly the qualities Lombardo valued. The relationship with Tony Spilatro was more complicated. Spilatro was everything DiFronzo was not: violent, unpredictable, and more reckless. Born on Chicago's West Side in 1938, Spilatro had grown up in the same neighborhoods as DiFronzo, surrounded by the same outfit culture. But where DiFronzo had learned discipline and patience, Spilatro had learned violence. Spilatro had a reputation as an enforcer, someone who would kill without hesitating when ordered to. He was also ambitious, always looking for ways to grow his business and make more money. In the early 1970s, the outfit sent Spilatro to Las Vegas to look after their interests in the casinos there. It seemed like a perfect job. Spilatro would make sure the stolen money kept coming back to Chicago, and he'd be far enough away that his violent habits wouldn't cause problems in the city. It didn't work out that way. Spilatro's time in Las Vegas would end in disaster, and his death would become one of the most famous events in outfit history. But in the 1960s, he and DiFronzo moved in the same circles, worked on some of the same jobs, and understood each other in the way that professional criminals do. These relationships with Peter, with Lombardo, and with Spilatro would define DiFronzo's career. When things went well, these were the men he celebrated with. When things went badly, these were the men he could count on. And when the police came knocking, these were the men who would keep their mouths shut. No talk about the Chicago outfit in the 1960s and 1970s would be complete without talking about Las Vegas. The desert city had become the outfit's most prized possession. A legal gambling paradise where millions of dollars passed through casinos that the mob secretly controlled. The basic plan was simple, but very effective. The outfit used loans from the Teamsters retirement fund, controlled by corrupt union leaders who were in the mob's pocket, to pay for the building of casinos. Once the casinos were built, mob-connected front men would run them, while the real power was with outfit members who watched over the business. Every night, before the day's profits were counted and written down, a part of the cash would be skimmed or taken off the top. This money never appeared on any books and never went through any official channels. It went straight into the mob's pockets, split among the different families and people who had paid for the businesses. At its best, the Las Vegas plan was making tens of millions of dollars each year for the outfit. It was more profitable than any of their other businesses. And because it was all in cash, it was almost impossible for the police to trace. The key to the operation was having trustworthy people in Vegas to watch over the skim and deal with any problems that came up. At first, that job fell to different mob members. But in 1971, the outfit sent Tony Spilatro to take over. Spilatro's job was simple: make sure the skim continued, protect the outfit's interests, and handle any problems that came up. What he wasn't supposed to do was draw attention to himself or create new problems. Spilatro did exactly what he wasn't supposed to do. He got involved in his own side businesses: drug dealing, robbery, and murder. He opened his own jewelry store, the Gold Rush, as a front for a burglary ring. He became romantically involved with Jerry McGee, the wife of Frank Lefty Rosenthal, the outfit's casino manager. And he developed a reputation for violence that brought unwanted police attention to the outfit's business. John DiFronzo watched all of this from Chicago. He knew Spilatro, had worked with him, and understood his skills and his flaws. He could see what was invisible to Spilatro himself: that this kind of high-profile violent behavior couldn't last. The outfit might put up with it for a while if the money kept coming, but eventually Spilatro would become a problem that needed to be solved. DiFronzo may have even been involved in some of the Vegas operations himself. FBI files suggest he traveled to Las Vegas often, and was at one point considered as a possible replacement for Spilatro. This makes sense. DiFronzo had the intelligence and discipline that Spalatro lacked, and he understood the importance of keeping operations running smoothly without drawing attention. But whether DiFronzo was deeply involved in Vegas or just watching from a distance, he was learning important lessons about what worked and what didn't in organized crime. The Vegas operations were making huge profits, but they were also bound to fail. The federal government was slowly building cases, planting listening devices, and turning witnesses. The violence and high-profile behavior that Spalatro showed might work for a little while, but it was a dead end in the long run. The smart move, the move that would define DiFronzo's own career, was to avoid the spotlight completely. Make your money, keep your head down, and never give the police an easy target. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, DiFronzo continued to work mainly as a burglar and thief, pulling off more and more advanced jobs that made a lot of money. He was also moving up in the outfit's ranks, taking on more responsibility and earning more respect. In 1964, police identified him as part of a loan sharking operation, working with former police officers. This was not unusual. Loan sharking was a basic outfit business, providing steady income with relatively low risk. You loaned money at very high interest rates, often 5% per week or more. If the person couldn't pay, you used threats and violence to encourage payment. The involvement of former cops gave the operation extra protection and a look of legitimacy. These officers knew how to get around the legal system and how to avoid the kind of attention that might bring in the federal government. They also kept connections to active police officers, providing information about ongoing investigations. But loan sharking was just one part of DiFronzo's criminal work. He continued to specialize in burglary and theft, especially high-end jewelry jobs. These required careful planning and execution, but they could be hugely profitable. One close call came in the early 1960s, though the specific details are few. What we know is that DiFronzo was arrested multiple times during this period, but was rarely found guilty. He was getting a reputation as someone who was either very lucky or very smart, probably both. Part of DiFronzo's success came from his understanding of the legal system. He knew how to talk to police, how to use his rights, and how to avoid saying anything that could be used against him in court. He knew which lawyers to hire, which judges might be sympathetic, and which prosecutors could be dealt with. More importantly, he understood the difference between being suspected of a crime and being charged with one. The police might know or strongly believe that you committed a crime, but proving it in court, beyond a reasonable doubt, was something else entirely. If you were careful, if you didn't leave evidence, and if you surrounded yourself with people who wouldn't talk, you could operate with almost no consequences. This was the lesson that Al Capone had failed to learn, and that Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo had mastered. The federal government would eventually catch you if you gave them enough time and enough evidence. The key was to never give them that opening. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, John DiFronzo had developed the way of thinking that would guide him throughout his career. He explained it to his associates in different ways over the years, but the main ideas were always the same. Stay quiet. Don't brag about your jobs. Don't tell people more than they need to know. Keep your personal life separate from your criminal life. The mob guys who got caught were usually the ones who couldn't keep their mouths shut. Stay smart. Plan carefully. Think about every angle. Consider what could go wrong and have a backup plan. Don't take risks you don't have to. The difference between a successful criminal and a dead or imprisoned one was often just paying attention to detail. Stay free. This was the ultimate goal. Money was great and respect was nice, but none of it mattered if you were behind bars. Every decision should be thought about with this simple question: will this make me more or less likely to stay free? These weren't new ideas. Tony Accardo had been teaching the same way of thinking for decades, but not everyone in the outfit followed it. Sam Giancana certainly didn't. His high-profile lifestyle and celebrity connections made him a target. Tony Spilatro didn't. His violence and side businesses in Vegas were bringing trouble that would eventually kill him. But John DiFronzo did follow it. He learned these lessons and made them the foundation of his career. While other mobsters got headlines, DiFronzo stayed in the shadows. While others sought publicity, DiFronzo avoided it. While others made themselves targets, DiFronzo made himself invisible. It was a slow, patient way to build power. There were no shortcuts, no sudden rises to the top. Just steady, careful work, building relationships, earning respect, and most importantly, staying out of prison. By the mid-1970s, DiFronzo was in his mid-40s, an age when many criminals either retired or ended up dead or in prison. But he was still working, still earning, and still mostly unknown to the public. His FBI file was growing, but he had never been found guilty of any major crimes. That was about to change. In December 1974, Christmas was coming, and John DiFronzo was about to be involved in one of the most important crimes of his career, one that would finally land him in federal prison and teach him lessons he would never forget. The target was the Teamsters Union's retirement fund headquarters in Chicago. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund was one of the most corrupt organizations in America, a piggy bank for organized crime that had been robbed for decades to pay for everything from Las Vegas casinos to mob-controlled businesses. But there was a difference between the mob having access to retirement, fund loans through corrupt union leaders, and the mob simply stealing directly from the fund. The first was what the outfit had been doing for years, getting loans on good terms, using the money for different operations, sometimes paying it back and sometimes not. The second was much more bold and much more dangerous. On the night of the robbery, DiFronzo and his crew, which included his brother Peter and several other outfit associates, broke into the Teamsters offices. According to the charges that would follow, they got away with about $1.4 million in checks, stocks, and other valuable papers. It was a huge score, the kind of payday that could set up a crew for years. But there was a problem. Stealing that much money from such a high-profile target guaranteed a huge federal response. The FBI, already focused on organized crime, would put enormous resources into solving the case. And unlike a jewelry store robbery or a warehouse burglary, this crime had clear mob connections. The Teamsters and the outfit were so connected that any major theft from the union would immediately be investigated as a mob operation. In other words, it was exactly the kind of high-profile, trouble-making crime that John DiFronzo had spent his career trying to avoid. Why did he do it? Maybe the money was too tempting. Maybe he was pressured by his bosses in the outfit who wanted the money. Maybe he simply made a mistake, breaking his own rules to chase a big score. Whatever the reason, the Teamsters robbery would prove to be a turning point in DiFronzo's life, and not in a good way. The FBI investigation moved quickly. By 1977, DiFronzo and several of his partners had been charged with federal theft related to the Teamsters robbery. The case against them was strong. The FBI had physical evidence, witness testimony, and other evidence that linked the men to the crime. DiFronzo fought the charges, as any good mobster would. He hired skilled lawyers, filed legal papers, and did everything possible to beat the case, or at least get a shorter sentence. But in 1979, at the age of 50, John No-Knows DiFronzo was found guilty and sentenced to federal prison. The exact length of his sentence is different in different reports, but he served about 3 years in federal prison. For a man who had spent his entire adult life avoiding exactly this outcome, prison must have been both embarrassing and a learning experience. Federal prison in the late 1970s and early 1980s was full of organized crime figures. The FBI's fight against the mob was starting to work. and prisons were increasingly filled with maid, members, and associates from different crime families. For DiFronzo, this meant he wasn't alone. He was with his own kind, men who spoke the same language and understood the same rules. But prison was still prison. You lost your freedom, your family life, your ability to earn money. You were put through the small embarrassments and disrespect of the prison system. You were at risk of violence from other inmates, abuse from guards, and the boring routine of prison life. More than that, prison was a sign of failure. The whole point of being smart, being careful, and being disciplined was to avoid exactly this. And yet, here DiFronzo was, sitting in a federal prison cell because he had broken his own rules and taken on a high-profile job that brought too much trouble. The experience taught DiFronzo lessons that he already knew, but maybe hadn't fully understood. First, federal cases were different from state cases. The FBI had resources that local police couldn't match. They could watch someone for months or years. They could pressure witnesses. They could build cases piece by piece until they were impossible to beat. Second, high-profile crimes weren't worth the risk. The Teamsters robbery had brought in a huge amount of money, but it had also brought in a huge federal response. A smaller, quieter job might earn less money, but it was far less likely to lead to a federal arrest. Third, and most importantly, the goal wasn't to score one big payday and retire. The goal was to last a long time. The goal was to keep earning, keep operating, and keep building power over decades. And you couldn't do that from a prison cell. When DiFronzo was released in the early 1980s, he was in his mid-50s, an age when most criminals had either retired or were near the end of their careers. But for John DiFronzo, his education was complete. He had learned everything he needed to know about how to survive in the modern world of organized crime. He would never make the same mistakes again. While DiFronzo was in prison, the world of organized crime was going through a huge change. The FBI had developed new tools and methods that were proving to be very effective against the mob. The most important of these was the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO. Passed by Congress in 1970, RICO allowed federal prosecutors to charge multiple people involved in a criminal group, even if they hadn't personally committed specific crimes. If you were part of a group that was involved in a pattern of criminal activity, you could be charged under RICO and face up to 20 years in prison. RICO completely changed the game for organized crime. Before RICO, prosecutors had to prove that you personally committed specific crimes. A good lawyer could often create reasonable doubt, especially if you were careful and didn't leave direct evidence. But under RICO, prosecutors could show that you were part of a criminal group and that the group committed crimes. They didn't need to prove you pulled the trigger or personally stole the money. They just needed to prove you were a member of the organization. This was terrifying for mobsters. It meant that your friends' crimes could be used against you. It meant that being a boss or a captain, even if you never personally committed violence, could lead to decades in prison. It meant that the entire structure of organized crime, the levels of leadership, the separation of leaders from street-level crimes, was suddenly at risk. The FBI was also getting better at spying. They had developed advanced listening devices that could pick up conversations in homes, cars, and meeting places. They had informants at every level of mob organizations. They had accounting methods that could trace money through complex webs of fake companies and foreign bank accounts. And perhaps most devastatingly, they had learned how to flip mobsters, to turn made members into government witnesses. The traditional mob code of omerta, the code of silence that had protected organized crime for generations, was breaking down. Facing decades in prison under RICO charges, more and more mobsters were choosing to cooperate with the government in exchange for shorter sentences. The Chicago outfit was feeling the pressure just like every other mob family. In 1986, a massive federal investigation led to charges against multiple high-ranking outfit members. It was the beginning of a wave of arrests that would wipe out the organization's leadership. Sam Giancana, the flashy boss who had run the outfit in the 1960s, had been murdered in 1975, likely on orders from outfit leaders who feared he might cooperate with the government. His replacement, Joey Ayupa, was convicted in 1986 along with several other top outfit leaders in the Strawman case, which was related to skimming money from Las Vegas casinos. Tony Accardo, the legendary Joe Batters, who had survived for decades by being smart and careful, was in his 80s and mostly retired. Paul Ricca had died in 1972. The old leaders who had built the modern outfit were gone, either dead or in prison. This created both a crisis and an opportunity. The outfit needed new leadership, men who could adapt to the new world of federal arrests and keep the organization's businesses running. They needed men who understood the old ways, the high-profile violence, the flashy lifestyle, the public presence were dead ends in the modern era. Men like John DiFronzo. When DiFronzo was released from federal prison in the early 1980s, he returned to a Chicago outfit that was in chaos. The organization was still powerful, still making millions of dollars from gambling, loan sharking, and other businesses, but it was under attack from the FBI, and its leadership was weak. DiFronzo returned to the Grand Avenue crew, working under Joey Lombardo, who was also rising in the outfit's ranks. But DiFronzo was no longer just a burglar or an enforcer. He was now a capo, a captain with his own crew, responsible for running businesses and sending money up to the outfit's leadership. The promotion made sense. DiFronzo had proven himself over decades of work. He had served his time without cooperating, following the code of silence that was essential to the outfit's survival. He was smart, disciplined, and capable. He understood how to run businesses profitably while keeping risk low. He was also, very importantly, relatively unknown to the general public. While names like Giancana, Ayupa, and Spilatro appeared regularly in newspaper headlines, DiFronzo had managed to stay out of the spotlight. He had no famous girlfriends, no high-profile court cases, and no dramatic arrests. The Chicago newspapers had barely mentioned him. This ability to stay unknown was like gold in the post-RICO era. The FBI knew who DiFronzo was. His name was in their files. He was watched from time to time. They understood his role in the outfit. But proving his involvement in specific crimes was difficult. He was careful, he was smart, and he had learned from his mistakes. DiFronzo's real business interests were also growing. He and his brother Peter owned D&P Construction and its trash hauling business. On paper, these were straight businesses, providing services and employing workers. But they also served as fronts for outfit operations, providing cover jobs for associates, and making cash that could be mixed with real income. This was the modern outfit strategy. Build real businesses that could provide legal income, while also serving as fronts for illegal operations. It was harder for the FBI to get inside than traditional mob operations. You couldn't just bug a social club and record mob business. You had to sort through the mix of real and illegal activity to build a case. By the mid-1980s, DiFronzo was in his mid-50s and at the peak of his criminal powers. He ran a successful crew, made a lot of income for the outfit, and had avoided serious legal problems since his release from prison. He was known within the organization as a reliable, smart worker, exactly the kind of man the outfit needed in its leadership. But a series of events in the mid-1980s would test the outfit like never before and create the situation that would eventually lift DiFronzo to the very top of the organization. By 1986, Tony Spilatro had become a huge problem for the Chicago outfit. His violent behavior in Las Vegas had drawn constant police attention. He had been arrested multiple times. He was suspected of many murders. His affair with Jerry McGee had become public knowledge, embarrassing Frank Rosenthal, the outfit's casino manager. Worse, Spilatro was suspected of skimming from the skim, taking money that was supposed to go back to Chicago and keeping it for himself. This was the ultimate betrayal in the outfit's eyes. You could be violent, you could draw attention, you could make mistakes, but you could not steal from the family. The outfit's leaders made a decision. Tony Spilatro had to go, and they would make an example of him. On June 14, 1986, Tony Spilatro and his younger brother, Michael, were tricked into going to a meeting in Bensonville, Illinois, a Chicago suburb. They were told it was a promotion meeting. Tony was going to be made a capo, and Michael was going to be made a member. It was an honor, a sign that despite all the problems, the outfit still valued them. It was a lie. When the Spilatro brothers arrived, they were jumped by a group of outfit members. They were beaten brutally, then killed. Their bodies were driven to a cornfield in Indiana and buried in a shallow grave. The story of the Spilatro murders would eventually become one of the most famous events in outfit history, made famous in the movie Casino. But in 1986, when the bodies were found, it sent a clear message. No one was untouchable. If the outfit decided you were a problem, they would solve that problem with extreme violence. John DiFronzo almost certainly knew about the Spilatro killing, probably ahead of time. He may have even been involved in some way, though no evidence ever connected him directly to the murders. But whether he was directly involved or not, the message was clear. This was what happened to mobsters who drew too much attention, who broke the rules, and who put their own interests above the organization's. It was a lesson DiFronzo had already learned, but the brutal end of his former associate made it even clearer. Stay smart, stay quiet, stay disciplined, or end up in a shallow grave. In 1986, the same year Tony Spilatro was murdered, the federal government filed RICO charges against top leaders of the Chicago outfit in what became known as the Strawman case. The charges were about skimming operations at Las Vegas casinos, specifically the Tropicana, Fremont, and Stardust. Multiple top outfit leaders were found guilty, including Joey Aiuppa, the boss, Jackie Chironi, the underboss, and Angelo LaPietra, a powerful capo. They received long federal sentences, which basically cut the head off the outfit's leadership. This left an empty spot at the top of the organization. Someone needed to run things, to make decisions, and to keep operations running smoothly. The usual structure would have had an underboss or powerful capo step up to fill the empty spot. But the outfit's leadership was destroyed. Almost everyone with high rank was dead, in prison, or too old to run things effectively. The man who came forward to fill this empty spot was John DiFronzo. Exactly how and when DiFronzo became the boss of the Chicago outfit is unclear. There was no official ceremony, no public announcement, and no newspaper headlines saying, "New mob boss takes control." That was the whole point. DiFronzo was going to run the outfit from the shadows in a way that made it almost impossible for the police to prove his role. What we know from FBI reports and court documents is that by the late 1980s, DiFronzo was being identified as a street boss or acting boss of the outfit. He was making decisions, settling arguments, and approving operations. He was, in effect, running Chicago's organized crime empire, but he was doing it in a way that no previous boss had ever tried. He wasn't holding meetings in restaurants or social clubs where the FBI could plant listening devices. He wasn't meeting with capos in ways that created clear leadership structures that prosecutors could use in RICO cases. He wasn't living a flashy lifestyle that would attract media attention. Instead, DiFronzo became a ghost. He worked out of his real businesses, the construction company and the trash hauling operation. He met with associates in ways that looked like normal business meetings. He communicated through go-betweens, having very little direct contact with street-level operations. He avoided being photographed, avoided giving interviews, and avoided doing anything that would put him in the public eye. To the outside world, John DiFronzo was just a businessman, a restaurant owner, a regular guy. Even his nickname, No-Nose, was rarely used in public. Most people who met him had no idea they were dealing with one of the most powerful crime bosses in America. This strategy of being invisible would define DiFronzo's time as boss. While the FBI knew who he was and what he was doing, proving it in court was nearly impossible. He left no paper trail, no recorded conversations, and no direct evidence linking him to specific crimes. He had become exactly what he had set out to be, the most successful mobster in Chicago history, because he was the one no one could see. The 1990s marked the start of a new time for the Chicago outfit, a time defined by John DiFronzo's new way of being a mob leader. While past bosses had ruled through fear, charm, or political connections, DiFronzo ruled by being absent. He was there, but he wasn't. Everyone in the outfit knew he was the boss, knew he was making the decisions, and knew he was collecting his share of the money. But proving any of this to a jury was nearly impossible. Part of DiFronzo's plan involved completely rethinking how a mob boss should act. Past bosses like Al Capone had held meetings in restaurants and nightclubs, surrounded by their workers and followers. They had been public figures, their faces known from newspaper photos and news videos. Even more recent bosses like Giancana had kept a high profile, dating famous people and appearing in public. They had believed that being seen, being known, was part of what made them powerful, that their reputations came before them and created the fear and respect needed to run a criminal group. DiFronzo understood that this way was like committing suicide in the post-RICO era. Every public appearance was a chance for the police to watch you. Every meeting with known criminals created evidence that prosecutors could use. Every photograph, every recorded conversation, and every witness who could testify to seeing you with other mob members was another piece of the federal case that would eventually send you to prison. So DiFronzo did something totally different. He disappeared. He didn't become a hermit, hiding in his home and refusing to go out. Instead, he hid right in front of everyone. He ran his real businesses, D&P Construction and his trash hauling company. He had investments in restaurants, including a suburban Italian restaurant where he could often be found. He went to family events, went to church, and lived what seemed to be a completely normal life. But he almost never appeared at outfit events in ways that could be recorded. He didn't hold meetings at mob hangouts. He didn't go to mob funerals, where FBI agents could photograph everyone there and figure out the group's structure. He didn't take part in mob rituals or ceremonies where informants might be present. When he needed to talk to other outfit members, he did so through go-betweens or in ways that couldn't be easily watched. He might have a real business meeting that also included some quiet talk about outfit business. He might pass messages through trusted friends. He might use coded language that meant nothing without knowing the context. The result was that, while the FBI knew DiFronzo was running the outfit, they couldn't prove it. They couldn't point to recordings of him ordering crimes. They couldn't find witnesses who had seen him at mob meetings. They couldn't show a clear line of command from DiFronzo down through the organization. In a RICO case, prosecutors needed to show that a person was part of a criminal group and that the group was involved in a pattern of criminal activity. But if you couldn't prove someone was part of the group, if they left no evidence of their involvement, then you couldn't charge them under RICO. DiFronzo had found the perfect loophole. He was running one of America's most powerful crime families, but he was doing it in a way that made him basically untouchable. One of DiFronzo's favorite spots in the 1990s and 2000s was a restaurant in a town just west of Chicago. It was the kind of place you could find in Italian neighborhoods all over America, with red and white checkered tablecloths, pictures of Italy on the walls, and big plates of pasta with red sauce. For DiFronzo, the restaurant had several purposes. It was a real business, making legal money. It was a comfortable place to meet with friends and family. And it was a neutral spot where he could sometimes do quiet business without getting the kind of attention that a known mob hangout would. FBI agents who watched DiFronzo during this time noted his routine. He would arrive at the restaurant in the late morning or early afternoon, often wearing casual but neat clothes. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed, "Mob boss." He would eat. He would chat with the staff and regular customers. And he would do what seemed to be normal business for a man with investments in different companies. To someone just looking, John DiFronzo was just another successful Italian-American businessman. Maybe he knew some people. Maybe he was a little connected, but nothing more. He wasn't wearing $1,000 suits or arriving in limousines. He wasn't surrounded by bodyguards or getting obvious respect. This carefully built image was key to DiFronzo's survival plan. Every part of his public self was designed to avoid giving prosecutors fuel for a RICO case. He kept real businesses so he could claim legal sources of money. He avoided known criminals unless it was absolutely necessary. He never spoke openly about outfit business where he might be overheard or recorded. The FBI knew what he was doing, of course. They weren't fooled by the Suburban Restaurant Owner Act. But knowing and proving are two different things. They needed evidence, recordings, documents, and witness testimony that could convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that DiFronzo was running a criminal group. And DiFronzo was careful never to provide that evidence. Running a criminal organization while staying this hidden required a carefully built structure. DiFronzo couldn't just disappear and expect the outfit to run itself. He needed capable helpers, clear ways to communicate, and systems that let him have control without creating written proof. The Chicago outfit under DiFronzo was divided into several crews, each running specific businesses and areas. The Grand Avenue crew, DiFronzo's home base, was still one of the most powerful. There was also the Elmwood Park crew, the Chinatown crew, and the 26th Street crew, among others. Each crew had a capo, or captain, who reported up the line of command, supposedly to DiFronzo, though proving this was almost impossible. DiFronzo's brother, Peter, played a very important role in this structure. The two brothers were extremely close, and Peter served as John's most trusted helper. When DiFronzo needed to communicate with other crews or make decisions about outfit business, Peter was often the go-between. This provided a layer of protection. If Peter was caught doing something illegal, it would be harder to connect it directly to John. DiFronzo also relied on a network of longtime friends who had proven their loyalty over decades. These were men who had come up with him, who understood how he worked, and who could be trusted to keep their mouths shut. In a world where more and more mobsters were flipping and becoming government witnesses, having a core group of absolutely reliable friends was essential. The outfit's businesses during this time were less flashy, but still made money. The days of massive casino skimming operations in Las Vegas were gone. Those had been shut down or taken over by real corporations. Instead, the outfit focused on traditional but steady sources of money: gambling, both sports betting and illegal casinos, loan sharking, controlling labor unions, and different extortion schemes. Street tax was a very important source of money. This was the money that different illegal operators, bookies, drug dealers, and thieves had to pay to the outfit for the right to work in Chicago. If you wanted to run an illegal gambling operation in the city, you paid the outfit a percentage. If you wanted to sell drugs on certain corners, you paid the outfit. If you refused to pay, you might find yourself out of business, or worse. DiFronzo watched over this system, making sure that payments were collected and sent up the chain. But he did so carefully, never directly handling money, never personally threatening anyone, and never creating the kind of evidence that could be used against him. His approach was working. Throughout the 1990s, while other mob families were being destroyed by RICO charges, the Chicago outfit stayed mostly together. Leaders in New York, Philadelphia, Austin, and other cities were going to prison for life. But in Chicago, John DiFronzo remained free. For the FBI agents tasked with investigating the Chicago outfit, John DiFronzo was a unique problem. They knew he was the boss. They had informants who told them so. They had surveillance showing him meeting with known criminals. They had evidence suggesting his involvement in different operations. But they couldn't build a RICO case that would stick. Every time they got close, DiFronzo would slip away. Witnesses would refuse to testify, or their testimony would be too unclear to be useful. Recordings would capture nothing criminal. Financial records would show real business deals with no clear connection to criminal activity. One FBI agent, who investigated DiFronzo for years later, called him the most successful mob boss in American history, specifically because he was so good at avoiding being arrested. This wasn't an exaggeration. By the early 2000s, DiFronzo had been running the Chicago outfit for nearly 20 years without being found guilty of any major crimes related to his position. The FBI tried everything. They placed listening devices in places where DiFronzo might meet with friends. They got informants inside the outfit. They followed him, photographed him, and documented his every move. They investigated his businesses, looking for money problems that might give them an opening for a case. They even tried more creative ways. In one case, agents approached DiFronzo directly, trying to convince him to cooperate. They told him they knew he was the boss, that they would eventually build a case against him, and that his best option was to help them in exchange for a shorter sentence. DiFronzo, according to reports, was polite but firm. He denied being involved in organized crime, claimed to be just a businessman, and refused to cooperate. He knew the game. The FBI's job was to convince him to say something to get himself in trouble, and his job was to give them nothing. This cat-and-mouse game went on for years. The FBI would get a lead, investigate it thoroughly, and come up empty. They would identify an operation, try to link it to DiFronzo, and find no direct evidence of his involvement. They would flip a low-level associate who claimed to know about DiFronzo's activities, only to find out that the associate had no first-hand knowledge, just rumors and guesses. By the early 2000s, DiFronzo was in his 70s and still free, still running the outfit, and still avoiding being arrested. For the FBI, it was more than frustrating. It was embarrassing. They had more tools, more resources, and more legal power than ever before. And yet, this one man, this ghost, continued to escape them. In the early 2000s, the FBI launched what would be known as the Family Secrets Investigation, possibly the biggest case against the Chicago outfit in history. The investigation was focused on Nicholas Calabrese, a made member of the outfit who had decided to cooperate with the government. Calabrese was a treasure for prosecutors. He had been a mob killer for decades, taking part in or seeing many murders. He could give detailed testimony about how the outfit worked, who the key players were, and how decisions were made. His cooperation led to charges against many outfit members, including several who had been untouchable for decades. The Family Secrets trial, which happened in 2007, was a huge event. Prosecutors presented evidence of 18 murders, along with many other crimes, including gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. They showed how the outfit had operated for decades, how it had corrupted unions and businesses, and how it had kept control through violence and threats. Multiple high-ranking outfit members were found guilty, including Joey, the clown, Lombardo, DiFronzo's longtime friend and mentor. Lombardo was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, specifically the murder of Daniel Seifert, a businessman who had planned to testify against outfit members. Lombardo received a life sentence and would die in federal prison in 2019. For John DiFronzo, the family secrets investigation was perhaps the most dangerous moment of his career. Nicholas Calabrese knew him, had worked with him, and could possibly give testimony about his role in the outfit. Multiple other people in the case could have tried to cooperate and give information about DiFronzo in exchange for shorter sentences. But DiFronzo was not charged. He was not even named as someone involved who wasn't charged. Despite the huge size of the investigation, despite Nicholas Calabrese's cooperation, and despite the FBI's determination to take down the entire outfit leadership, John DiFronzo remained untouched. How did he do it? The answer is in DiFronzo's decades-long plan of keeping his distance from actual crimes. Calabrese could testify about murders he had been part of, about meetings he had attended, and about orders he had received. But apparently, he couldn't give direct evidence linking DiFronzo to specific crimes. This was the genius of DiFronzo's approach. He had been careful for decades to avoid being present when actual crimes were committed. He didn't personally kill people, didn't personally collect gambling debts, and didn't personally threaten victims. He made decisions and gave orders, but he did so in ways that couldn't be proven in court. When the family secrets trial ended in 2007 with multiple people getting long prison sentences, John DiFronzo was still free. He was 78 years old and had outlasted almost everyone from his generation of outfit members. His friends were dead or in prison. His mentors were long gone. His competitors had all been beaten. And he was still operating, still running what was left of the Chicago outfit, and still collecting money from operations across the city. By the late 2000s, the Chicago outfit was a shadow of what it used to be. The glory days of Capone, the profitable years of the Vegas skim, and the huge criminal empire of the mid-20th century were all gone. What was left was a smaller, more local operation. The outfit still controlled gambling and loan sharking in parts of Chicago. They still collected street tax from different illegal operators. They still had influence in some unions and real businesses. But the size and scale of their operations had shrunk dramatically. Part of this was because of more pressure from law enforcement. The FBI had gotten much better at investigating and arresting organized crime. RICO laws gave them powerful tools. Electronic spying had improved a lot, and the willingness of mobsters to cooperate with the government had increased. Omerta, the code of silence, was breaking down across all the major crime families. But part of it was also because of changes in the criminal world itself. Other criminal groups, street gangs, drug cartels, and international criminal networks were competing for the same illegal markets. The Italian-American mob's control of organized crime was fading, replaced by a more diverse and broken-up criminal world. For John DiFronzo, this changing world required him to keep adapting. The outfit couldn't rely on the same sources of money that had supported it for decades. They needed to find new opportunities, new markets, and new ways to make money. DiFronzo, showing the same intelligence and flexibility that had marked his entire career, adapted. The outfit moved more deeply into internet gambling, taking advantage of websites in other countries that were hard for the police to shut down. They continued to control traditional gambling operations, but updated their methods, using cell phones and secret messages instead of face-to-face meetings in social clubs. They also invested more heavily in real businesses, using them both as fronts and as actual sources of money. DiFronzo's construction and trash-hauling businesses gave jobs to outfit associates, while also making legal money that could be mixed with illegal profits. This strategy of mixing real and illegal money made it even harder for law enforcement to build cases. How do you prove that someone's income is illegal when they have real businesses that could possibly make that same income? How do you show that a construction company is a front for mob operations when it's actually building buildings and hiring workers? DiFronzo had basically created a mixed organization, part traditional mob, part real business empire. It was less profitable than the outfit had been in its glory days, but it was much more able to last, and it kept DiFronzo out of prison. By the 2000s, John DiFronzo had beaten almost all of his predecessors in one very important way. He had lasted a long time. Al Capone, the most famous Chicago mob boss, had ruled for less than a decade before going to prison. Sam Giancana had been murdered. Joey Aiuppa had died in prison. Tony Accardo had managed to avoid being found guilty for most of his life, but even he had faced many charges and investigations. DiFronzo, on the other hand, had been running the outfit for more than 20 years without being found guilty of any crimes related to his position as boss. He had managed to do what Capone, Giancana, and almost every other major mob boss had failed to do. He had beaten the system. The difference with Capone was especially clear. Capone had been the most powerful gangster in America, a man whose name was linked with organized crime. He had lived a fancy life, surrounded himself with luxury, and made himself a public figure. And he had gone to prison in his early 30s, spending the rest of his life either in jail or suffering from the effects of advanced syphilis. Capone's mistake had been believing that power meant being visible, that being a successful mobster meant being known and feared. He had sought publicity, given interviews to newspapers, and made himself into a celebrity. In doing so, he had made himself a target that the police couldn't ignore. DiFronzo had learned from Capone's mistakes. Power didn't need visibility. In fact, in the modern era, visibility was dangerous. The most powerful mobster wasn't the one everyone knew about. It was the one working effectively in the shadows. Giancana had made a similar mistake. His relationships with famous people like Frank Sinatra and Phyllis McGuire, his involvement in CIA plots against Fidel Castro, and his high-profile lifestyle had all brought him attention. That ended up being fatal when he was murdered in 1975. It was likely because outfit leaders feared he might cooperate with the government to avoid being arrested. DiFronzo, on the other hand, had no famous friends, no high-profile affairs, and no involvement in international plots. He was just a businessman, a restaurant owner, a family man, and that lack of fame had kept him alive and free. Even Tony Accardo, who had famously avoided being found guilty for decades through a mix of intelligence and luck, hadn't managed what DiFronzo did. Accardo had faced many investigations and charges. He had been forced to testify before grand juries. He had lived under constant police watch. DiFronzo faced watching, too, of course. The FBI was always watching. But he had managed to avoid giving them anything they could use. No charges, no trials, no public embarrassment. Just quiet, steady control of Chicago's underworld. By any measure, John DiFronzo had become the most successful mob boss in Chicago history. Not because he was the most violent, or the most creative, or the richest, but because he was the one who survived in a business where survival was the ultimate achievement. DiFronzo was the ultimate success story. In August 2011, John DiFronzo was 82 years old and had been running the Chicago outfit for more than 20 years. For the FBI, his continued freedom was an embarrassment, a reminder that even with all their tools and resources, they had not been able to build a case against him. But they were still trying. In August 2011, FBI agents carried out search warrants at homes and businesses connected to DiFronzo and other suspected outfit members. They were looking for evidence of gambling operations, specifically illegal sports betting and video poker machines. The raids were part of a larger investigation into outfit gambling operations across the Chicago area. Agents took computers, financial records, and other materials that they hoped would provide evidence of criminal activity. They also questioned DiFronzo. According to reports, he was polite but uncooperative, as he had been every other time the police had approached him. He denied knowing anything about illegal gambling operations, claimed that any gambling at his businesses was done by employees without his knowledge or approval, and generally gave investigators nothing useful. In the end, the 2011 investigation led to no charges against DiFronzo. Some lower-level associates were charged with gambling-related crimes, but the man at the top, the boss who supposedly watched over all outfit operations, remained untouched. For the FBI, it was another frustrating failure in a decades-long effort to charge DiFronzo. They knew he was guilty and had strong evidence of his involvement in organized crime, but they couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. For DiFronzo, it was proof that his life strategy worked. He had built an organization that protected him from being charged. He had stayed disciplined for decades, and at age 82, despite the FBI's best efforts, he remained free. After the 2011 investigation came up with nothing, John DiFronzo continued to lead what was left of the Chicago outfit. But by this time, he was well into his 80s, and age was finally catching up with him. The outfit itself continued to shrink. Many of DiFronzo's longtime friends were dead or in prison. The organization's income had dropped a lot from its peak decades earlier. Pressure from law enforcement continued, with the FBI and local police constantly watching known outfit members and investigating any suspicious activity. But the outfit still existed, still operated, and still made money from gambling, loan sharking, and other illegal activities. And as long as it existed, DiFronzo remained its leader. His daily routine had changed little over the years. He still worked out of his real businesses, still met with friends in ways that seemed normal and legal, and still kept up the image of a successful businessman who happened to have grown up in neighborhoods where organized crime was present. FBI surveillance continued, but with less intensity than in previous years. The agents assigned to watch DiFronzo knew that building a case against him that could be prosecuted was nearly impossible. They documented his activities, noted his friends, and kept files on his operations. But they had little hope of actually charging him with anything. For DiFronzo, this was the final result of his life's work. He had outlasted everyone: his mentors, his peers, and his enemies. He had built a criminal empire and run it successfully for decades. And he had done it all while avoiding the fate that happened to almost every other major mob boss: death or a long time in prison. By the mid-2010s, DiFronzo's health was failing. The exact details of his medical problems were not widely reported. He kept his privacy even as his body got weaker. But friends and FBI observers noted that he was moving more slowly, appearing in public less often, and generally showing the signs of old age. For a man in his late 80s who had lived a hard life, including years of stress, time in prison, and the constant pressure of running a criminal organization, this decline was going to happen. But it also raised questions about the future of the Chicago outfit. Who would take over when DiFronzo died? The organization had no clear replacement, no obvious person to take his place. DiFronzo's brother Peter was only a few years younger and in poor health himself. Other possible choices were either too old, in prison, or didn't have the respect needed to lead the organization. Some police officials believed that when DiFronzo died, the Chicago outfit would basically stop existing as a connected organization. It might break up into smaller crews working on their own, or it might just fade away completely, unable to compete with more modern criminal groups. Others believed that the outfit would survive in some form, maybe with a group of leaders instead of a single boss. The organization had existed for nearly a century and had survived many crises. Perhaps it would adapt once again. But for John DiFronzo, these questions were becoming less important. His time was running out. On Sunday, May 27, 2018, John "No Nose" DiFronzo died at his home in Chicago. He was 89 years old and had been the boss of the Chicago outfit for more than 30 years, far longer than any of the bosses before him. The news of his death was reported in Chicago newspapers and picked up by some national news outlets. But it didn't get the kind of widespread attention that the death of a major mob boss might have gotten decades earlier. By 2018, organized crime was no longer the cultural fascination it had been in the time of Capone or even Giancana. The Mafia was seen as a thing of the past, far less threatening than drug cartels or international terrorist groups. But for those who understood the history of organized crime in Chicago, DiFronzo's death marked the end of an era. He had been the last of a certain generation of mob bosses, the last man to successfully lead a major American crime family while avoiding being charged for his leadership role. The exact cause of his death was not publicly announced, though given his age, it was likely related to natural causes or long-term health problems. What mattered was that John DiFronzo had died in his own bed, surrounded by family, having never been found guilty of any major crimes related to his decades as a mob boss. In a world where mob bosses typically end up in prison or murdered by rivals, this was an amazing achievement. DiFronzo had beaten the odds, beaten the system, and beaten the government. He had lived a long life and died a free man. His death was noted by the FBI, which had spent decades trying unsuccessfully to charge him. Some agents expressed a reluctant respect for his ability to avoid being charged, while others simply moved on to other investigations. With DiFronzo gone, the Chicago outfit was no longer the priority it had been for generations. Perhaps the most amazing part of John DiFronzo's career is what didn't happen. He was never found guilty of any major organized crime charges during his time as boss of the Chicago outfit. Yes, he had been found guilty in the 1970s for his role in the Teamsters retirement fund theft, a serious federal crime that landed him in prison for several years. And he had various minor arrests and convictions earlier in his career, mostly for burglary and theft. But from the time he became boss of the outfit in the late 1980s until his death in 2018, a period of about 30 years, John DiFronzo was never successfully charged with any crimes related to his leadership of organized crime in Chicago. This is almost unheard of in modern mob history. Other bosses from the same time, like John Gotti in New York, Raymond Patriarca in New England, and Nicky Scarfo in Philadelphia, all ended up in federal prison, found guilty under RICO laws that gave prosecutors powerful tools to take apart criminal organizations. The FBI had the same tools, the same resources, and the same legal power when investigating DiFronzo. They had informants, surveillance, financial records, and years of investigative work. They knew he was the boss, knew he was involved in criminal activities, knew he was ordering operations and collecting profits. But they couldn't prove it in court. DiFronzo's strategy of being invisible, his discipline in avoiding any recorded involvement in crimes, and his careful building of a real business front all combined to make him basically untouchable by federal charges. This wasn't luck. It was the result of decades of careful planning, constant watchfulness, and an understanding of how the modern legal system worked. DiFronzo had studied what happened to other mob bosses, learned from their mistakes, and built his entire approach around avoiding their fate. And it worked. When he died in 2018, John DiFronzo had accomplished something that almost no other major mob boss in American history had managed. He had run a powerful criminal organization for decades and gotten away with it. In the months and years after DiFronzo's death, the Chicago outfit continued to exist in some form, but it was a weak shadow of what it used to be. Without DiFronzo's leadership and the relationships he had built over decades, the organization struggled to stay together. Different law enforcement officials and organized. Crime experts argued about whether the outfit still existed as a working organization or had broken into independent crews with no central leadership. Some argued that the Italian-American mob in Chicago had basically stopped existing, replaced by street gangs and other criminal organizations. Others claimed that the outfit survived in a smaller way, still controlling some gambling and loan sharking operations, but without the power and reach it once had. What wasn't up for debate was that John DiFronzo represented the end of an era. He was, in many ways, the last true Don of Chicago, the last man to successfully lead the outfit as a united organization with significant power and influence. The outfit had survived for nearly a century, from its beginnings in the Prohibition era, through its peak years in the mid-20th century, and into the modern era. It had produced legendary figures: Al Capone, Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca, Tony Accardo, and Sam Giancana, whose names became linked with organized crime. But of all these men, John DiFronzo was arguably the most successful, precisely because he wasn't legendary. He didn't want to be famous, didn't want his name in newspapers, and didn't want to be known outside the small circle of people who needed to know who he was. His legacy was his absence from the public record, his ability to operate for decades without creating the kind of evidence that could be used against him. While other bosses went to prison or were murdered, DiFronzo simply continued working, earning, and surviving. In the end, John DiFronzo's ultimate victory was simple. He died free. This might seem like a low standard for success, but in the world of organized crime, it was actually an amazing achievement. The vast majority of major mob bosses end their careers in one of two ways: murdered by rivals or put in prison by the government. Very few die of old age in their own beds. Al Capone died of disease after spending years in prison. Sam Giancana was murdered in his own basement. Joey Aiuppa died in federal prison. John Gotti died in prison. Whitey Bulger was murdered in prison. The list goes on and on. Mob boss after mob boss, all meeting violent or imprisoned ends. But not John DiFronzo. He lived to be 89, ran the Chicago outfit for 3 decades, and died peacefully at home. He was never forced to become a government informant to save himself from the life sentence. He never had to look over his shoulder, wondering if his own organization had marked him for death. He never spent his final years in a federal prison, cut off from his family and the world he had known. This was his ultimate victory. He had played a dangerous game for his entire adult life and had won. He had outsmarted law enforcement, outlasted his rivals, and ultimately outlived the era of organized crime control that had defined much of the 20th century. Was he a good man? Of course not. He ran a criminal organization that was involved in gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and violence. He profited from the suffering and desperation of others. He corrupted real institutions and weakened the rule of law. But was he successful at what he did? Absolutely. By the twisted standards of organized crime success, wealth, power, long life, and freedom, John DiFronzo was perhaps the most successful mob boss in American history. He had learned the ultimate lesson that so many other criminals failed to grasp. It's not about being the most feared, or the most powerful, or the richest. It's about surviving. It's about waking up in your own bed, year after year, decade after decade, while your rivals end up dead or in prison. John DiFronzo mastered the art of survival. And in the brutal world of organized crime, it made him the greatest of them all. In the years since DiFronzo's death, the Chicago outfit has continued its long, slow decline. The organization that once controlled gambling, politics, and various real industries across Chicago and much of the Midwest now operates on a much smaller scale, if it can be said to operate as a single group at all. Law enforcement officials have identified some people as potential leaders or important members of what remains of the outfit, but none have the importance or power that DiFronzo had. The organization seems to be broken into smaller crews that operate with some level of independence, sometimes working together on larger operations but lacking the central command structure that defined the outfit for most of its history. Part of this breakup is simply the natural result of DiFronzo's death. He was the glue that held the organization together, a man with the relationships, respect, and intelligence to coordinate operations across multiple crews. Without him, there was no obvious replacement, no one who had the same level of respect from all groups. But the outfit's decline also shows broader changes in American organized crime. The Italian-American mob, which controlled organized crime for much of the 20th century, has been steadily losing ground to other criminal organizations. Street gangs control much of the drug trade in Chicago. Mexican cartels have established a significant presence. International criminal networks engage in complex financial crimes that the traditional mob never mastered. The outfit's traditional sources of money have also declined or disappeared. The glory days of casino skimming are long gone, ended by corporate ownership of Las Vegas casinos and advanced accounting practices that make skimming nearly impossible. Controlling labor unions is harder in a time of declining union membership and increased government oversight. Even traditional gambling operations face competition from legal sports betting and online casinos. What remains is a smaller, local operation that makes modest profits from illegal gambling, loan sharking, and occasional extortion. It's still organized crime, still illegal, and still harmful. But it's a far cry from the massive criminal empire that the outfit represented at its peak. Some law enforcement officials believe the Chicago outfit will eventually stop existing entirely, dying out as its aging members retire or go to prison and younger generations choose other criminal businesses or real careers. Others believe it will survive in some form forever, adapting to new realities and new opportunities as it has for nearly a century. What's clear is that the era of powerful, united mob families controlling major American cities is over. The outfit that John DiFronzo led was already a smaller version of what had existed in previous generations. And whatever comes after him is likely to be even smaller and less important. In this sense, DiFronzo truly was the last Don of Chicago, the last man to lead the outfit as a powerful, united criminal organization with significant reach and influence. The era he represented, for better or worse, is over. John DiFronzo's story is ultimately about the power of being invisible. In a time when famous criminals became household names, when mob bosses sought publicity and enjoyed their reputations, DiFronzo understood that the key to success was being forgotten. He wasn't the toughest gangster in Chicago's history. He wasn't the most violent, the most creative, or the wealthiest. He didn't revolutionize organized crime or create new criminal businesses. He simply mastered one crucial skill. He knew how to disappear. While law enforcement focused on more showy targets, DiFronzo quietly built and maintained power. While other bosses made mistakes that led to their downfall, talking too much, trusting the wrong people, letting their egos get in the way of their judgment, DiFronzo remained disciplined and careful. His approach required a patience that most criminals lacked. It required resisting the urge to show off, to enjoy the signs of power, and to let people know who you really were. For decades, DiFronzo lived a double life. Publicly a businessman and restaurant owner, privately the most powerful crime boss in Chicago. The fact that he pulled this off for 30 years, through a time of unprecedented law enforcement attention on organized crime, is remarkable. The FBI had every tool available: RICO laws, electronic surveillance, financial accounting, and a willingness to flip witnesses. They knew who DiFronzo was and what he was doing, and still, they couldn't touch him. This is what made DiFronzo unique in mob history. Other bosses survived for years by being smart or lucky. But DiFronzo survived for decades by being invisible. He created a system that protected him from prosecution, built an organization that could operate without creating evidence of his involvement, and lived a life that appeared completely legitimate to anyone who didn't know better. In some ways, his success represents a failure of the justice system. A man who committed serious crimes for decades escaped prosecution and died free. But in other ways, it represents a perfect understanding of how that system works. DiFronzo knew exactly what prosecutors needed to convict someone under RICO laws, and he made sure they never got it. The funny thing is that by being so successful at avoiding attention, DiFronzo denied himself the fame that many mob bosses wanted. Al Capone is a household name a century after his crimes. John Gotti became a tabloid star. Even lower-level mobsters like Henry Hill became famous through movies like Goodfellas. But John DiFronzo? Most Americans have never heard of him. Even in Chicago, outside of law enforcement and organized crime circles, his name means little. He was the most powerful mob boss in the city for 3 decades, and most people don't know he existed. This lack of fame was the price of his success, and it was a price he willingly paid. Fame meant attention, and attention meant prosecution. It was better to be unknown and free than famous and in prison. John DiFronzo's story reminds us that the most dangerous criminals are not always the loudest. They're not the ones on television or in newspaper headlines. They're not the ones making public threats or showing off their wealth. The most dangerous criminals are the ones who never see coming. They're the ones who understand how to work within the system, how to avoid creating evidence, and how to maintain power without attracting attention. They are the patient ones, the disciplined ones, the ones who can wait for rewards and play the long game. DiFronzo represented a certain change in organized crime, the shift from flashy public gangsters to invisible managers of criminal businesses. The mob bosses of the Prohibition era could afford to be public figures because law enforcement didn't have the tools to effectively charge them. But as those tools improved, the smart criminals adapted. DiFronzo was smarter than most. He saw what was happening to other mob bosses and learned from their mistakes. He understood that RICO laws changed everything, that electronic surveillance made traditional mob operations dangerous, and that witness cooperation was weakening omerta. And he changed his entire approach because of it. He became what the modern era of law enforcement couldn't easily prosecute. A ghost who left no evidence, had no direct involvement in street-level crimes, and surrounded himself with layers of protection. It made it nearly impossible to prove his role in criminal operations. In the end, DiFronzo's greatest achievement was simply this: he survived. In a job where survival is rare and long-term survival is almost unheard of, he managed to operate at the highest levels for more than 5 decades without suffering the fate that happens to almost every other major criminal. He proved that in the modern age, the key to criminal success isn't violence or threats or even new ideas. It's discipline. It's patience. It's the willingness to be forgotten by everyone except the people who matter. John DiFronzo's story is a reminder that the criminals we should worry about most aren't the ones making headlines. They're the ones we never hear about, the ones who are smart enough, disciplined enough, and patient enough to operate in the shadows while everyone else is distracted by the noise. If you've made it this far in the story, spending the last few hours with us exploring the hidden life of John No-Nose DiFronzo, you're clearly interested in the untold stories of organized crime, the stories that go beyond the movies and the myths to reveal the complex reality of how criminal empires actually work. John DiFronzo's story is remarkable precisely because it's so unremarkable in the traditional sense. He wasn't a pop culture star like Al Capone. He didn't have celebrity friends like Sam Giancana. He wasn't a violent psycho like Tony Spilotro. He was just a very smart, very disciplined criminal who understood that in the modern era, the best way to run a mob is to make everyone forget you exist. And in doing so, he accomplished something that almost no other major mob boss has ever managed. He beat the system. He ran one of America's most powerful crime families for 3 decades and died free, never convicted of any crimes related to his leadership role. That's not just luck. That's genius. But DiFronzo's story is also a window into a larger truth about organized crime in America. The era of powerful, united mob families controlling major cities is coming to an end. The Italian-American Mafia that dominated organized crime for much of the 20th century is in decline, replaced by more diverse and fragmented criminal networks. DiFronzo was the last of a kind, the last true Don who could command respect across multiple crews, who could settle disputes and coordinate operations, who represented a united organizational structure rather than loose groups of independent criminals. When he died in 2018, an entire era of American crime died with him. The Chicago outfit still exists in some form, but it's not what it was. It may never be again. And that's partly because there's no one else like John DiFronzo. No one with his intelligence, his discipline, and his ability to operate for decades without giving law enforcement the evidence they needed to prosecute him. But there was a cost to DiFronzo's strategy of being invisible. He lived a restricted life, always watching what he said, always aware that he was being watched, and always maintaining the act of being just a businessman. He couldn't celebrate his achievements publicly. He couldn't tell his story or set the record straight about what he had accomplished. When he died, the newspaper obituaries were brief and factual, noting his death and his suspected role in organized crime, but providing little detail or context. There was no celebration of his life, no public acknowledgement of what he had achieved. Putting aside the moral questions of whether running a criminal organization should be celebrated, he simply died, and most of the world didn't notice or care. For a man who had spent more than 50 years at the center of Chicago's underworld, who had held enormous power and gained significant wealth, and who had outsmarted federal law enforcement for decades, this quiet, unnoticed end must have been exactly what he wanted. But it also meant that his story, his strategies, and his unique approach to organized crime leadership would all be largely forgotten. In a way, DiFronzo's invisibility continued even after his death. The world moved on quickly, barely pausing to note the passing of a man who had been one of the most powerful crime bosses in America. This is the ultimate irony of John DiFronzo's life. He was so successful at being invisible that even his death went largely unnoticed. He won the game by refusing to play it in the traditional way. He achieved power by refusing to show it off. He secured his legacy by ensuring that most people would never know he existed. What can we learn from John DiFronzo's life? For those of us who aren't trying to be criminals, hopefully all of us, the lessons are more general but still useful. First, the importance of discipline. DiFronzo succeeded because he had iron discipline, the ability to stick to his plan, even when it would have been easier or more immediately rewarding to change it. How many of us have that kind of long-term discipline in our own lives? Second, the power of patience. DiFronzo didn't try to achieve everything at once. He built his power slowly over decades, never rushing and never taking unnecessary risks. In our culture of instant rewards, there's something almost admirable about that kind of patience, even if the end goal was criminal. Third, the value of knowing the rules of the game. DiFronzo understood exactly how federal prosecution worked, what evidence was needed to convict someone under RICO, and how to structure his operations to avoid creating that evidence. He studied the system and learned how to operate within it, or just outside it. Fourth, the recognition that sometimes the best way to win is to not be noticed. In a world where everyone is competing for attention, where social media encourages us to constantly announce our achievements, DiFronzo's strategy of being invisible is almost revolutionary. He proved that you can be incredibly successful while being completely unknown. Of course, we should be careful not to romanticize DiFronzo or his life. He was a criminal who profited from others' suffering, who ran an organization that engaged in violence and corruption. His success came at a real cost to real people, the victims of outfit violence, the businesses extorted, and the communities corrupted. But as a case study in strategy, discipline, and long-term thinking, DiFronzo's life is undeniably fascinating. He played a dangerous game at the highest possible stakes and won. That's worth studying, even if we reject the moral framework that made such a life possible. John DiFronzo's death in 2018 marked the end of more than just one man's life. It marked the end of an era in American organized crime, the era of powerful Italian-American mob families that had defined much of the 20th century's criminal world. The forces that led to this decline were many and complex. Increased federal law enforcement attention, particularly the use of RICO laws, made running traditional mob operations far more dangerous. The breakdown of omerta meant that more mobsters were willing to cooperate with the government rather than face long prison sentences. Competition from other criminal organizations, street gangs, drug cartels, and international networks wore away at the mob's traditional control. But perhaps most importantly, the cultural and economic situations that had created the Italian-American mob were disappearing. The close-knit immigrant communities where mob organizations had thrived were blending into mainstream American culture. The real opportunities available to Italian Americans had grown dramatically, reducing the appeal of organized crime as a path to success. The neighborhoods where DiFronzo grew up, where joining the outfit seemed like a natural, even respectable choice, had changed. The social clubs where mob members once gathered openly were closing or had been taken over by other communities. The political corruption that had protected mob operations was harder to maintain in a time of investigative journalism and federal oversight. In short, the world that had created and supported the Chicago outfit was disappearing. And with DiFronzo's death, the last link to the outfit's glory days was broken. This doesn't mean that organized crime disappeared from Chicago or anywhere else. Criminal organizations still exist, still make enormous profits from illegal activities, and still corrupt real institutions. But they look different now. More diverse, more fragmented, and more technologically advanced. The days of a single Italian-American boss controlling all organized crime in a major city are over. The days of powerful mob families with clear leadership and territorial control are fading. The era that produced figures like Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, and John DiFronzo has ended. And perhaps that's fitting. Those men and the organizations they led represented a particular moment in American history, a time when waves of Italian immigration created isolated communities, when Prohibition created enormous opportunities for criminal business, and when law enforcement lacked the tools to effectively fight organized crime. That moment has passed. The America of 2018, when DiFronzo died, was fundamentally different from the America of 1928, when he was born. The criminal world had evolved, and the old-style mob boss, even one as successful and adaptable as DiFronzo, was becoming outdated. Despite his success at remaining invisible, John DiFronzo's story is worth remembering and studying, not because we should celebrate his criminal achievements, but because his life sheds light on important truths about crime, power, and survival in America. His story shows us that intelligence and discipline can be more powerful than violence and threats, that long-term strategic thinking can overcome short-term problems, and that understanding systems and rules can be more valuable than breaking them in obvious ways. His story also shows us the limits of law enforcement in a free society. The FBI knew what DiFronzo was doing, but couldn't prove it in court because he was careful never to create the kind of evidence that would stand up to the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. This is both a strength and a weakness of our legal system. It protects innocent people from being wrongly convicted, but it also sometimes allows guilty people to escape justice. DiFronzo's life raises questions about how we define success, what we value, and what we're willing to sacrifice to achieve our goals. He achieved enormous power and wealth, lived a long life, and died free. By conventional criminal standards, he was extraordinarily successful. But he also lived under constant surveillance, maintained a fake identity for decades, and ultimately left little public legacy. Was it worth it? That's a question only DiFronzo could have answered, and he took that answer to his grave. The story of John No Knows, DiFronzo, is not just a crime story. It's a story about power, strategy, and the human ability for discipline and long-term thinking. On one level, it's the story of a criminal who succeeded where almost all others failed, who ran a major crime family for decades and died free. That's remarkable enough on its own. But on another level, it's a story about understanding systems and learning how to operate within them. DiFronzo studied federal law enforcement, understood what prosecutors needed to convict someone under RICO, and structured his entire life around denying them that evidence. He turned the justice system's strengths, its requirement for proof beyond a reasonable doubt, its procedural protections for defendants, into his own shields. It's also a story about the power of patience and discipline in achieving long-term goals. DiFronzo didn't try to become the most powerful mob boss overnight. He spent decades building relationships, earning respect, and learning the business. When opportunities arose, he was ready. When dangers appeared, he was prepared. Most importantly, it's a story about the value of being invisible in a world obsessed with being visible. At a time when other mob bosses were becoming celebrities, when being known was considered the same as being powerful, DiFronzo understood that true power didn't require recognition. In fact, recognition was dangerous. It made you a target for law enforcement and rival criminals alike. By making himself invisible, DiFronzo achieved something that more flashy criminals never could: a long life. He survived while others fell. He operated while others were in prison. He built and maintained power while remaining largely unknown to the general public. This strategy required sacrifice. He couldn't enjoy the fame that came with being a well-known crime boss. He couldn't tell his story publicly or set the record straight about his achievements. He had to live a restricted life, always maintaining his cover and always watching what he said and did. But in return, he got 50 years of freedom and power. He got to die in his own bed at age 89, having beaten the federal government at its own game. He got to achieve his goals without paying the price that almost every other major crime boss paid. Was it worth it? That's a judgment each of us must make for ourselves. What's undeniable is that by his own standards, freedom, a long life, and success in the criminal business he chose, John DiFronzo was phenomenally successful. Throughout the story, we focused on DiFronzo's strategy, his methods, and his approach to running the Chicago outfit. But what about the man himself? Who was John DiFronzo beyond his role as a crime boss? The truth is, we don't know much. That was the whole point of his strategy: to reveal as little as possible, to leave no traces, and to make himself unknowable to anyone outside his immediate circle. We know the basic facts. Born in Italy in 1928, came to America as a child, grew up in Chicago's Italian neighborhoods, started his criminal career as a burglar, and eventually rose to lead the outfit. We know he was married, had a family, and maintained real businesses. We know he was considered intelligent, disciplined, and capable by those who knew him. But what did he think about? What were his regrets, his fears, his hopes? Did he ever question the life he had chosen? Did he feel guilty about the harm his organization caused? Did he take pride in his success at avoiding prosecution? Or did he see it simply as necessary for survival? We'll never know. DiFronzo took those answers to his grave, just as he took so many other secrets. The man behind the ghost remains largely unknown, which is perhaps fitting for someone who spent his life creating invisibility. What we're left with is the legend, the story of the mob boss who became a ghost, who ran one of America's most notorious crime families while barely leaving a trace. It's a story that will likely grow with time as the details become fuzzier and the man becomes a myth. But even now, with DiFronzo only a few years dead, his story has power. It reminds us that the most dangerous criminals are not always the loudest or most visible. It shows us that intelligence and discipline can be more valuable than violence or threats. It demonstrates that true power sometimes lies in being forgotten by everyone except the people who matter. If you've stayed with us through this entire journey, from DiFronzo's birth in Italy, through his rise in the Chicago outfit, his decades as boss, and his death in 2018, thank you. This is not an easy story to tell, because so much of it involves what is missing, rather than what is there, what didn't happen, rather than what did. His story matters because it sheds light on truths about organized crime, law enforcement, and power in America that more dramatic mob stories sometimes hide. It shows us that the real battle between criminals and law enforcement isn't fought in shootouts or courtroom showdowns. It's fought in the careful gathering and checking of evidence, in the decisions criminals make about how to structure their operations, and in the long, patient work of building cases and conducting investigations. We've spent the last few hours together exploring the life of a man most people have never heard of, John No-Nose DiFronzo, the last Don of Chicago. If you found this story fascinating, we've got dozens more like it. Deep looks into the forgotten figures of organized crime, the criminals whose intelligence and strategy made them far more dangerous than the flashy gangsters who got all the headlines. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We dig deep into criminal history to bring you the stories that matter, the ones that reveal how organized crime really works rather than how Hollywood shows it. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed this documentary. It helps us reach more people who appreciate careful research and storytelling about true crime. And drop a comment below. What other mobster story should we cover next? Are you interested in learning about the New York families, the Philadelphia mob, the Detroit partnership? Or maybe you want to hear about the modern changes in organized crime, the cartels, the international networks, the cyber criminals. Let us know what fascinates you. Thank you for spending these hours with us in the shadows of Chicago, exploring the life of a man who made being invisible into an art form. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the most dangerous criminals are often the ones you've never heard of. The best criminals are the ones you never see coming. John DiFronzo proved that. And somewhere out there, someone is learning from his example.